The hum of the generator was the only sound in the bunker. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the heavy oak table, and into the bones of the 7 men sitting around it. It was 2:14 a.m. Outside, the jungle of the Magdalena Medio was screaming with life. Inside, the air was dead, stale with cigarette smoke and the coppery taste of adrenaline. These 7 men were not enemies of the Medellín cartel. They were its pillars. They were the ones who moved the cocaine. They were the ones who laundered the money. They were the ones who had built the empire brick by bloody brick. And tonight, they were gathered here for one reason: treason. At the head of the table, Fernando tapped his gold lighter on the wood. Tap, tap, tap. "He is weak," Fernando whispered. "He is hiding in a prison he built for himself. He is bleeding us dry with his war against the state. The routes are closed. The money is stopping." The man next to him, a heavy-set trafficker named Kiko, nodded slowly. He looked at his watch. "If we move tonight," Kiko said, his voice barely audible, "we can take the labs in the south. We can cut off his cash flow. Without money, the soldiers will not fight for him. Without soldiers, he is just a man in a cage." They looked around the table. 7 nods, unanimous. It was decided. The king was dead. Long live the new kings. Fernando smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just won a lottery he hadn't bought a ticket for. He reached for the bottle of aguardiente in the center of the table to pour a toast, but his hand froze in midair. The heavy steel door at the far end of the bunker didn't burst open. It didn't explode. It simply clicked. The sound was tiny, insignificant, but in that room, it sounded like a thunderclap. The door swung open slowly. A single figure stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing body armor. He wasn't holding a machine gun. He was wearing a bathrobe and slippers. He walked into the room with the casual indifference of a man walking into his own kitchen for a glass of water. He didn't look at the guards, who were now staring at the floor, terrified. He only looked at the table. He walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Fernando. He sat down. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed his eyes. "Gentlemen," Pablo said, his voice thick with sleep, "you are being very loud. It is difficult to rest." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a heart stopping. Fernando's hand was still hovering over the bottle. He was shaking so badly, the ice in his glass began to clink. "Patron, we were just discussing strategy for the business." Pablo looked up. His eyes were dark, heavy, and completely devoid of surprise. "Strategy," Pablo repeated. He reached into the pocket of his robe. The 7 men flinched as one. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small black cassette tape. He slid it across the mahogany table. It spun, hissing against the wood, until it stopped perfectly in front of Fernando. "I know," Pablo said softly. "I listened to your strategy. I found it ambitious." He leaned forward. "But you made a mistake in your calculations, Fernando. You counted the soldiers. You counted the money. You counted the kilos." Pablo picked up an apple from the fruit bowl. He polished it on his sleeve. He took a bite. The crunch echoed like a bone breaking. "You forgot to check who owned the bunker you are sitting in." If you're drawn to the untold stories of power, betrayal, and men who ruled through fear rather than noise, you're already in the right place. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The massacre that followed was not a battle. It was a correction. History will tell you that Pablo Escobar was a paranoid madman who killed his friends for no reason. They will tell you he lost his mind in La Catedral prison. They are lying, or they simply do not understand. Pablo Escobar was not paranoid. He was precise. The meeting in the bunker was not a secret rebellion that Pablo stumbled upon. It was a play, a theater piece orchestrated by Pablo himself to see who would clap and who would draw a knife. This is the story of how the most powerful criminal in history allowed a coup to form right under his nose, watered it like a garden, and then, in one single night, harvested it. To understand the purge, you have to understand the layout of the chessboard in 1992. Pablo was incarcerated in La Catedral, a prison he built, a prison guarded by his men, a prison that was, in reality, a fortress. From there, he still ran the empire, but distance creates doubt, and doubt is a cancer. His lieutenants, the Galeanos and Moncadas, were on the outside. They were handling the day-to-day. They were handling the cash. And cash has a way of sticking to fingers. Pablo began to notice discrepancies. A shipment that was lost to the police, but no arrest report was filed. A stash house that was raided, but the neighbors heard no sirens. He knew they were stealing. But theft he could forgive. Theft is just greed. What he couldn't forgive was the conversation his intelligence network intercepted one Tuesday afternoon. "The old man is finished," a voice said on the wiretap. It was Fernando Galeano. "It is time for a change in management." Most leaders would have sent a hit squad immediately. They would have reacted with anger. Pablo reacted with patience. He didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to expose them. He wanted the rest of the organization to see, with perfect clarity, what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. He needed them to feel safe. So, he invited them. "Come to La Catedral," the message said. "We need to discuss the new routes. There is a problem with the police. I need your advice." It was a stroke of genius. He asked for their help. He played the role of the confused, isolated leader who needed his strong captains to save him. It fed their ego. It confirmed their bias. "See," Fernando told Kiko, "he is desperate. He needs us. Now is the time to press him." They went up the mountain in a convoy of luxury SUVs. They passed the checkpoints. They passed the guards who saluted them. They felt like kings arriving to accept a surrender. They walked into the prison. They were escorted to the main meeting room. There was food. There was whiskey. Pablo greeted them warmly. He hugged them. He asked about their wives, their children. He poured them drinks. He disarmed them with normalcy. For 3 hours they talked business. Pablo nodded, took notes, asked questions. He seemed distracted. He seemed tired. The conspirators exchanged glances. "It is true," their eyes said. "He is finished." Confidence grew in the room. They began to speak louder. They began to interrupt him. They began to make demands. "We need to increase our percentage, Pablo," Kiko said, leaning back in his chair. "The risk is higher for us out there." "Of course," Pablo said humbly. "You are right. You deserve more." He was feeding them rope, yard by yard. And then the mood shifted. It wasn't something Pablo said. It was something he did. He stopped taking notes. He closed the notebook. He placed his pen down on the table, perfectly parallel to the edge. He looked at the clock on the wall. "Do you know what time it is?" Pablo asked. "It is almost midnight," Fernando said. "No," Pablo said. "It is time for the truth." He pressed a button under the table. The side door opened, but it wasn't waiters who entered. It was Popeye. It was Otto. It was the inner circle of sicarios. The men who didn't care about money, only about Pablo. They were armed, but they didn't raise their weapons. They just stood there, lining the walls. The air in the room turned to ice. "I have a question," Pablo said, his voice suddenly sharp, devoid of the fatigue he had feigned all night. "If you steal from a man, you are a thief. If you kill a man, you are a murderer. But what are you if you betray the man who made you who you are?" Fernando stood up. "Pablo, we—" "Sit down," Pablo whispered. Fernando sat. "I gave you everything. I took you from the streets. I gave you millions. I gave you power. And in return, you decided that I was inconvenient." He picked up the cassette tape, the one from the bunker meeting, and held it up. "You thought I was deaf?" He tossed the tape to Popeye. "You thought I was blind?" He looked at Kiko. "You thought I was stupid?" The realization hit them like a physical blow. The weakness was a trap. The confusion was a ruse. The prison was not a cage for Pablo. It was a spider web for them.